I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening to hear our speaker, Jemar Tisby. Up front, I'd like to thank the Valparaiso Human Relations Council for supporting tonight's event through its Community Cultural Grant. We are honored to be one of the partners helping to increase awareness, appreciation, and dialogue in our community among diverse and traditionally underrepresented groups. For those of you who don't know, my name is Thais Carter, and I direct the Institute for Leadership and Service here at Valparaiso University. We offer a number of programs to help prepare students for lives of leadership and service, lives that we believe should be shaped by a sense of calling, equipped for thoughtful reflection, engaged in the larger world, and responsive to its deepest challenges. One word that we use quite a bit, and it can be scary for some people, is vocation. And we believe that more than just how students make a living, the vocation is the broader work of how all of us make a life and make a community. And our Pathways to Purpose speaker series invites women and men to share their stories in order to help expand student imagination about what pursuing purposeful work and a meaningful life can look like. Now, Jemar Tisby has the kind of professional or vocational story that we think students need to hear. A young person formed by his humanities education at Notre Dame, joining Teach for America after graduation as part of the 2003 Mississippi Delta Corps. He taught 6th grade at KIPP Delta College Preparatory School, and after 4 years of teaching, began a seminary career at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida. He returned to KIPP to serve as principal for 3 years and finished his MDiv at RTS Jackson. He helped to found the Whiteness, a Black Christian collective that engages issues of religion, race, justice, and culture from a biblical perspective. And he's co-host of Pass the Mic, a podcast produced by The Whiteness. He's spoken nationwide at conferences, and his writing has been featured in the Washington Post, CNN, and Vox. And then there is his scholarship, which brings us here tonight. Jemar is a PhD student in history at the University of Mississippi, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. His new book, The Color of Compromise, which we will have available for sale over here, provides a unique survey of American Christianity's racial past, revealing the concrete and often chilling ways that people of faith have worked against racial justice. Now, this weekend, I had the distinct pleasure of attending a conference focused on vocational exploration for undergraduate students. And there were a number of breakout sessions, and I was interested to see that at least a handful were actually focused on the vocation of institutions, examining the ways large entities understand their own mission and work in the world, and how that sets a tone for everyone who participates in those institutions. So I share that to say this. Jemar Tisby has a great personal story, and one that I hope our students will ask him about later as they think about their own vocational discernment. But tonight, I am thankful that he is here to share a much bigger story, that of the church in America and how it understood its vocation then throughout history and how it is living it now. Institutions, including churches, denominations, and yes, even universities, need to be asking the big questions that we ask of our students, of ourselves. What is our purpose? What is our calling? And how do we respond to the deepest challenges of our time? As the Institute for Leadership and Service considers our own vocation, we think that bringing in conversation partners that engage the intellectual curiosity of our students and community members and help foster their deep desire to live a life of not only charity, but justice is most certainly on brand. So, thank you for being here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jemar Tisby.
The young folks tell me it's not official unless you get a selfie. So we're going to do a still picture and then a quick video. So on 3, everybody say, try to look good. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. Now, on 3, everybody yell, cancel compromise. Cancel compromise. 1, 2, 3.
Cancel compromise!
Thank you. Now, you'll be Instagram famous before you know it. I want to start by reading an excerpt from the book, and choosing this particular story was very meaningful, and I'll unpack why toward the end. And this is from chapter 1. 4 young girls, busily prepared for their big day. It was September 15th, 1963. the day of the Youth Day service at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And the girls, along with the other young people of the congregation, would spend the next few hours singing songs, reciting poems, praying, giving encouraging messages in front of hundreds of beaming parents. The girls, Addie Mae Collins, 14, Denise McNair, 11, Carol Robertson, 14, and Cynthia Wesley, 14, had just finished Sunday school and were in the church basement making final adjustments on their white dresses when the bomb exploded. The blast, which killed all 4 girls and injured at least 20 others, left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It decapitated Cynthia. Her parents could only identify her body by her feet and by the ring she had been wearing. A newspaper report at the time indicated that all of the church's stained glass windows had been destroyed except one, and that window depicted Christ leading a group of children. The white face of Christ had been blown out. 3 days later, an integrated crowd of thousands of mourners gathered at 6th Avenue Baptist Church for a funeral for 3 of the 4 girls. So many people attended that the crowd spilled out of the sanctuary and onto the street. The cover of this book shows that scene. Before the funeral, on the day after the bombing, a young white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. delivered a lunchtime speech at Birmingham's all-white Young Men's Business Club. Of course, he'd heard about the tragedy in his city, and this lifelong Southerner jotted down some words about racism and complicity that would prove to be a turning point in his life. Reflecting on the events, he said, "Who did it? Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? The answer should be, we all did it. Every last one of us is condemned for that crime and the bombing before it and a decade ago. We all did it." Morgan realized that no matter who had physically planted the dynamite, all the city's white residents were complicit in allowing an environment of hatred and racism to persist. The acts that reinforced racism happened in countless common ways. Morgan explained the who is every little individual who talks about the niggers and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rock the party with laughter. Morgan also recognized that Christians bore as much responsibility as anyone for the state of race relations in the city. He said, "It is all the Christians and all their ministers who spoke too late in anguished cries against violence." He then asked a series of rhetorical questions for his listeners to respond to. Did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and express their regrets in person or pray with crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks of their churches? Now, some white Birmingham residents did not receive Charles Morgan Jr.'s speech well. Though many hurled death threats at Morgan himself, the threat that most disturbed him listed every place his wife and son had been on a recent Sunday. Morgan soon closed his law practice and moved elsewhere to engage in a long career of civil rights. Now, although many people from Birmingham and beyond expressed outrage at the murder of these 4 black girls at church, Morgan's point stands out. The most egregious acts of racism, like a church bombing, occur within a context of compromise. The failure of many Christians in the South and across the nation to decisively oppose racism in their families, communities, and even in their own churches provided fertile soil for the seeds of hatred to grow. The refusal to act in the midst of injustice is itself an act of injustice. Indifference to oppression perpetuates oppression. I think in those words, Charles Morgan Jr. captures the idea of complicity. When we talk about Christian complicity with racism, it's not that every single person was this rabid racist, hurling racial epithets or burning crosses on people's lawns. What we're talking about is at the many junctures within U.S. history when American churches and Christian individuals could have stood up against the racist status quo. Instead, they responded with silence or passivity. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the color of compromise. If the future is going to be different than the past, then we must learn from the lessons of history, especially the ugly, the brutal, the repulsive ones, the ones that we're tempted to turn away from like they don't exist. This book says, don't look away. Don't look away from the horror of the American church when it comes to racism. Now, one question about the book that I'm surprised I don't get more often is based on the title. It's called The Color of Compromise. And so a natural question would be, what is the color of compromise? Is it royal blue? Hot pink? Fuchsia? I don't know what fuchsia looks like. You held it in front of my face, I couldn't tell you. I'm going to say, and this is no offense to anyone's national flag that happens to have these colors, it just worked out this way. I'm going to answer that question, what is the color of compromise, by saying the color of compromise is green for the greed that undergirded American race-based chattel slavery. I'm going to say that the color of compromise is white, representing whiteness and white supremacy. And I'm going to say that the color of compromise is red, because at the end of the day, a system of oppression based on race can only be and must be enforced through physical violence. The color of compromise is green, it is red, it is white. And so, I'm going to unpack each of these and then close with a call to action, because this generation is responsible for canceling compromise when it comes to the American church and racism. So with that very light opening, let's get in. Let me begin with this quote from James W.C. Pennington, who was a minister and an abolitionist in the 1800s. He talks about this concept of the chattel principle. I said slavery was American race-based chattel slavery. Chattel means property. Here's what Pennington said. The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle. The property principle. The bill of sale principle. Now the cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences. What Pennington is saying is that through the strange alchemy of American race-based chattel slavery, you turned people into property. In a capitalist system, your goal is to maximize your profit and minimize your losses. Now, as you graduate and go forth, and some of you are already working, what's the biggest slice of your budget? It's almost always wages and benefits to your employees. So, if you want to increase your bottom line, the best thing to do is to pay your workers less, or better yet, don't pay them at all. That's what happened with American race-based chattel slavery, is that they had an entire labor force that was in bondage and unfree and unpaid. Why? So that they could maximize their profits off of the crops that they grew. This is why, fundamentally, we have to understand American race-based chattel slavery as an economically exploitative system. Yes, it was racist. Yes, it was supremacist. Yes, it was all those things. But it was also fueled by the desire for money. Old school, what the Bible calls avarice. Now, this is not to say that racism didn't exist before slavery or that the two are totally separate, right? Now, slavery became enshrined as a system because it was profitable. But you never needed any excuse for one person not to like other people. So there was always some sort of prejudice, some sort of bigotry. What happened with race-based chattel slavery is that it becomes enshrined in an institution, the peculiar institution called slavery. But there was money to be made by enslaving people of African descent. This is why the Mississippi Articles of Secession in January 1861 started the Civil War, and we'll talk more about that later. But here's what Mississippi said when it broke off from the Union. It said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce on the earth." You hear those words? Material and commerce. What Mississippi legislators were saying is that if you take away slavery, you have ruined our economy. The color of compromise is green. Race-based chattel slavery turned a person into property like real estate or a horse or a cart. This is why on slave ships they packed so many people onto the ships. Because they weren't packing people, they were packing cargo, like you would tobacco or fruit or whatever you would ship. And what was interesting to me is in researching for this book, most ships that transported Africans were not built as slave ships. They were built as something else, and they had to be retrofitted to transport hundreds of human beings. And they didn't construct them for comfort. They construct them for volume. And so that's why, as you look at this, you have maybe a foot or a foot and a half between each row. And when you see up here, you pack human beings in as much as possible. And what slave ship captains would do is count on a certain number of slaves dying. You're not feeling me. They would count on a certain number of human beings made in the image of God dying on the ship. Another interesting fact is when those ships cross the Atlantic, oftentimes sharks would swim behind the ship. Sharks are naturally scavengers, and so what would happen when these people died is they'd toss them overboard and they'd get a free meal. That's how they treated human beings. Let me try to make it real for you. There was an enslaved man named Olaudah Equiano who wrote a narrative. These narratives are critically important because oftentimes in the period of enslavement, the actual experience of enslaved Africans was filtered through white voices, and you never got the full picture. So these slave narratives were a first-hand account of what people endured. Equiano was kidnapped from his homeland in Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe. He was only about 11 or 12. And he talks about family separation, because when you treat people as property, your family connections don't matter. He said, "The next day proved of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated. While we lay clasped in each other's arms, it was in vain that we besought them, the enslavers, not to part us. She was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth. And he asked, O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God? Do unto all men as you would men should do unto you. Cynical, here's another quote that from a historian, Forrest Wood. He said, cynical though it may sound, it is not an exaggeration to submit that the critical fact in determining who opposed slavery and who supported it was a consequence entirely of political and economic factors. All of the Christian conviction in the world could not dent the purse of one slaveholder. Let me give you a point of controversial application. In the book I write, the only other R word that's more controversial than the word racism is the word reparations. Certain segments of American society have been discipled into thinking that's absolutely off the table. Let me ask you this. If for several centuries you had a labor force that was not paid, it took a bloody war to emancipate them. In other words, it wasn't people just changing their minds and seeing the immorality of slavery. They had to fight and lose a war in order for emancipation to occur. Now, you have recently freed black people who have never been compensated for their labor, and women for their reproductive labor along with their labor in the field. And you say, okay, go now, be free, but you don't give them a penny. The land that they worked, that the drops of their sweat fueled, that their blood soaked into, reverted back to plantation owners, who then instituted another form of enslavement, this time through poverty. We call it sharecropping. And generations down, those sharecroppers never get access to education, never get access to advancement, never get any sort of financial compensation for what their ancestors endured. So now that you have a racial wealth gap, where for every $1 a white person has, a black person has 7 cents, you can either tell me black people are just really bad with money and white people are really good with it, or you can tell me there's something wrong with the system. So in my view, you cannot talk about racial justice unless you talk about money. Now what that looks like, I don't know. What I'm arguing is that we need to at least study it and figure out. Because the only other thing that happens is, after the Civil War, it didn't happen. During the Jim Crow era, it didn't happen. In the Civil Rights era, it didn't happen. Now in this era of Black Lives Matter, shall we be complicit? Shall we continue to kick the can down the road to subsequent generations so far down you just say, well, it's been too long, we can't do anything about it? It's a call to action for our generation. The color of compromise is green. But that's not all. The color of compromise is also white. One of the themes in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. As long as the idea of white supremacy persists, racism and inequality will remain. I'm trying to put you on game here. I'm trying to let you know how racism works. It's built on a narrative of racial difference. So white supremacy, that's a jarring word, especially for white people. Ah, white supremacy, man, it's a heavy word. But it's true. What does white supremacy mean? That whiteness is central often superior, and normal than compared to anyone else or anything else. That's why when I went to seminary, I learned theology when it was from Europeans. But when it was from someone else, it was called black theology or Latino theology. Why? Because whiteness is normative. And whiteness is, another way to explain it, or white supremacy, is the narrative of racial difference, as my friend Daniel Hill describes in his book, White Awake. The simple fact is this: specific manifestations of racism change, but the reason why racism persists is because the narrative of racial difference persists. The story we tell ourselves about race is consistent, even though the forms of racism change. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Changing systems, consistent narrative. So early on in U.S. history, you could see white supremacy functioning very blatantly through slavery. People with literal physical chains on them. But then we fought this bloody civil war, and now those physical chains are gone, but you have Jim Crow, which is legalized policies enshrined in state constitutions and local customs that enforce the separation of races we call segregation. And then you have this big dramatic civil rights movement, which they call the Second Reconstruction. And now racism's over, right? I say right now we're living in an era of a racialized society. That's based on Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's book, Divided by Faith, where racism works impersonally through institutions and systems, and it doesn't require anyone sort of having personal hatred towards someone else. All it requires is for the system to operate as it was designed to do. Let me go back a little bit. Here's the problem with whiteness. Whiteness has at least 3 effects. I'll talk about 2 now and 1 later. First of all, whiteness obscures ethnicity. And this is for white people. So here's what happened, is when Europeans came to what became the United States, there was this thing that got constructed, race is socially constructed. Over time, what happens is whiteness has currency. Whiteness has social currency, so that to be white is to have certain advantages in this society. And what happened with Europeans is when you came to America, you became white, which meant you were no longer French or British or Italian or German or whatever it was. You were now white. All those ethnicities got lumped together. And so I have a theory. I went to seminary down in Jackson, Mississippi, and what would happen when these white guys from like New England or the Midwest or California, they'd come down to Mississippi, they'd go to seminary, and all of a sudden they would start wearing bow ties and seersucker suits and sporting beards. I'm like, where do you come from? You're not Colonel Sanders down here. And what was happening is that they didn't have a sense of their own national or ethnic heritage. And so the only way they could have a unique sense of culture and identity was to latch on to whiteness, which is very strong in the South. There's this whole Southern culture, the Southern gentleman culture, and so it was very easy and tangible to see down there where they were. But what happens is when you latch onto whiteness, whiteness can only be formed in relation to its equal and opposite other, which is blackness. And that's the second effect. Whiteness creates this category of blackness, which is not equal in terms of dignity, it's lower. It's the antithesis of whiteness. And what happens is you categorize people as black. They're no longer Nigerian or Ethiopian or anything like this. They're black. And that automatically means marginal. It means second class. It means lesser in various different ways, politically, economically, socially, culturally, all of that. People of African descent have been perceived to have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, less of everything than white people. And then in between white and black are all the different shades of brown. You got white and non-white. You got white, people of Asian descent, people of Latin American descent, Native Americans, and then all the way at the other extreme you got black people. So it captures everybody and erases ethnicity, particularly for white people, and creates this equal and opposite other category of blackness. And what happens is, until we change that narrative of white supremacy, we're going to see the manifestations of racism change, but racism itself as an ideology remains. With me so far?
Yes.
All right, let me give you a quick illustration. What we're talking about is Christian complicity in racism. So how do Christians get into this? I think you would probably know that there's been some connection between Christianity and the Ku Klux Klan. But let's get specific. The Ku Klux Klan had three major iterations. One was 1866, right after the Civil War, to fight Reconstruction in the South. The last one was in the 1950s and 60s to fight the Civil Rights Movement. The second one, which in many ways was the most widespread and toxic one, was in 1915. That year is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the year that the nation's first blockbuster movie came out. It was called Birth of a Nation. It was a black and white, silent 3-hour film that showed the rise of the KKK, and I could go into detail, but it depicted the KKK as this heroic group of men who took back the South from northern carpetbaggers and black Union soldiers and folks who got out of place. That same year, partly inspired by this movie, a white man who was a former Methodist circuit rider, a preacher, he gathered a group of friends. They went to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which on the front depicts several Confederate generals as heroes. They built an altar, and on that altar, they put an American flag and a Bible, and then, in a ceremony reminiscent of the Scotch-Irish tradition, they burned a cross on the top of the mountain. That was the birth of the second wave of the KKK. I'll give you one more example. A man named G.T. Gillespie was the president emeritus of Belhaven College, now university. A white Christian man. He gave an address in 1954, shortly after Brown v. Board, which desegregated public schools, and his address was called A Christian View of Segregation. In it, he tries to make a biblical justification for this racial segregation of black and white people. Now, he admits the Bible contains no clear mandate for or against segregation as between white and Negro races. So he says there's no specific passage in the Bible that says black and white people can't mix, but that doesn't stop him. He goes on and resorts to so-called natural law arguments. He said, segregation is one of nature's universal laws. There are many varieties of the bird family, for example, but under natural conditions, so far as known, bluebirds never mate with redbirds, doves never mate with blackbirds, nor mockingbirds with jays. And based on this natural law argument, he says black and white people shouldn't get married or have children. Then he turns his speech from natural law to the scriptures. And he says Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, admonished the Israelites not to mix, quote, diverse things like wool and linen, as well as different strains of cattle and different kinds of seeds. And then based on that, he says the same principle would apply with even greater force with respect to human relations. You see what I'm getting at here? Christians using the Bible to justify first slavery and then racial segregation. As Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative says, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. I go to school in Mississippi, the last state in the Union that has the Confederate emblem on the flag. And why do you think it's still on the flag? Because the North won the Civil War, but the South, the ideology of, really not the South, but the ideology of white supremacy won the narrative war. Lastly, the color of compromise is red. I mentioned a moment ago 2 effects of white supremacy. 1, that it erases ethnicity, and 2, that it creates the equal and opposite category of blackness. But there's one more effect of white supremacy. White supremacy says that in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control, violence is necessary. Physical violence has always been necessary for the maintenance of white supremacy. There's a quote from the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, Between the World and Me, that is haunting. He says this: "It's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body." Listen, all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. That's from Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28. And there is a divine fingerprint on each of us that is indelible, and there is a spark within each of us that says, I am worthy. I have dignity. I am a human being equal to everyone else. And no matter what kind of oppression you put on people, that spark can never completely be extinguished. So what happens when that ember turns into a flame is you got to snuff it out. And how do you snuff it out? Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's through violence. That's how white supremacy maintains its grip at the end of the day, is through violence. Now, I said at the beginning, this book says, don't look away. And this is one of those times where it would be more comfortable to look away, but you can't. If you want to fight for racial justice today, you have to know the ugliness of racial sin. And that's why I have to talk about lynching. Let me tell you about Luther and Mary Holbert. As with many of these cases, the exact details are unknown. I can tell you it started over love. It was a love triangle where a black man, Luther Holbert, was in a relationship with Mary Holbert, who had been in a previous relationship with another black sharecropper. The other black sharecropper got the plantation owner, James Eastland, to come and confront Luther Holbert. This is down in Mississippi in 1904. We don't know what happened when James Eastland, the plantation owner, who's a white man, and this other black sharecropper went to confront Luther Holbert, but at the end, both of those two end up dead, likely in self-defense. And Luther knows it's a death sentence for him. So he and Mary go on the run. Obviously, a posse is gathered of white men with dogs and bloodhounds, and they catch up with Luther and Mary 3 days later. The lynching didn't happen immediately. It was planned for the next day, a Sunday afternoon, after church, so that a larger crowd could gather. And the murderers strategically chose their location for maximum effect. It was on the land of a black church. The black church has historically been the locus of religious and communal life for black people, so performing a lynching on church ground would send a message to black people that no place was safe from white power and white hatred. More than 1,000 people showed up to gawk at the lynching. First, they tied the Holberts up, and then they commenced with, quote, the most fiendish tortures. First, the white murderers cut off each of the fingers and toes of their victims and gave them out as souvenirs. Then they beat the bodies of Luther and Mary so mercilessly that one of Luther Holbert's eyes hung from its socket. Then followed the most fiendish abuse. The Vicksburg Evening Post reported, the most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. The instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and woman, in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out. The spirals tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time it was withdrawn. Finally, the Holberts, who were still alive, were taken to a pyre. The white men cruelly forced two black men under the threat of death to drag the Holberts to the fires. They burned Mary first, so Luther could see his beloved killed. And then they burned him. That's just one example of a lynching among the nearly 5,000 known cases of these extrajudicial murders designed ultimately to reinforce racism and white supremacy, often committed at the hands, or at least with the approval, of Christians. One more thing I have to tell you is that violence, racial violence, was gendered. It impacted men and women differently. Men, women, and children were all lynched, but one form of racial terror was reserved for women. It was rape. On September 3rd, 1944, Reese Taylor was on her way home from late-night worship at Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, Alabama. Historian Danielle McGuire wrote that Taylor had been walking with two other churchgoers when a green sedan filled with 7 young white men pulled to a stop on the road. Holding her hostage at the point of a shotgun, they accused Taylor, who had been with her companions and at the church all that day, they accused her of stabbing a white man earlier that night. They ordered her to get into the back of the car, drove her to a secluded pecan grove, and said, "Get them rags off." The white ringleader and his companions took off their pants, and 6 of them proceeded to rape her. Afterwards, they deposited her on a dark highway, and she walked home. Unfortunately, crimes such as the one Reese Taylor suffered had been all too common in American life, stemming back to the earliest days of slavery. Rape persisted as a sexualized form of racial terror. Women were targeted for reasons as varied as retribution for perceived offenses to drunken fits of lasciviousness. As civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer would later explain, a black woman's body was never hers alone. Just to give you a sense of how recent these kinds of events happened, Reese Taylor only just died in December of 2017. I wish I had time to go into more detail about how violence has been used to reinforce white supremacy. I could talk about the origins of the police force. I could talk about Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin. I could talk about any number of things, but what we have to understand is that the color of compromise is red. Now, I said I would leave you with a charge, because the temptation is to think, well, this is all in the past. What does it have to do with me? Thank goodness we're post-racial. But that's not the case, is it? I write in the book that even though The Color of Compromise is a book about the past, it's really about the present and the future of the church. And the book was almost called The Fierce Urgency of Now, except some professor at Princeton had already taken the title. But it's based on Martin Luther King Jr.'s words from a speech called the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Now, we all remember that part about not being judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. But early on in the speech, King says something that I think is powerful, and let's hear it from himself. Nope.
We have also come to this hallowed spot.
I'm sorry.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
That was 1963, and we've seen immense progress in the past half century. From black presidents to the Black Panther movie, black people have made incredible advances. And thank God we're not where we used to be. But in many ways, King's phrase, the fierce urgency of now, still applies to the American church today when it comes to complicity in racism. And so in the book, I talk about what I hope happens after you read it. See, most people, we think of racism as a simple one person hating another person. People who are actively using racial slurs and disliking other people. Think of it as a pedway. All right. You go to the airport. There's like this human conveyor belt, right? You get on and it takes you, right? Now, racists are the people who are really in a rush. They get on that pedway and they're walking. And while they're walking, the pedway is still moving, so they're moving faster than the rest of the people on the side because they're in a real hurry to get to the destination, which is more white supremacy. Then there's the other people who get on the pedway, and they're okay. They're just lazy. So they're not walking, they're just on the pedway. But guess what? The pedway is still moving. And I don't have to rush in order for me to still end up at the same destination. Those are the non-racist or the passive racists. What I hope is after you read this book that you are on this pedway, which is American society moving in the direction of white supremacy, and instead of being actively racist and walking and rushing toward the destination, or being passively racist, just letting the status quo carry you along, you would get on that pedway, but stop and turn around and walk in the other direction. To be anti-racist, you got to actively fight this thing. And so the question is, why don't we do it?
Amen.
Why has the church been complicit in racism for so long? I think it boils down to one major word: fear. When Paul confronts Peter for withdrawing from eating with the Gentiles, why did Peter withdraw? It says when certain men came from Jerusalem, he withdrew because of what? Fear. I think a lot of times what prevents us from fighting racism and being anti-racist in our day is that fear. Fear of man is what the Bible calls it. We're afraid of what they might call us. Now, they called me every name in the book. It's really interesting the names they come up with to call you when you start talking about racial justice. They start calling you a communist. They did that in the 60s. They call you a Marxist, right? There's one I really kind of like. I kind of want to get a t-shirt with it. It says social justice warrior. I feel like that's pretty cool. If I'm going to be a warrior, I'm going to be a warrior for justice. They'll call you all kinds of names, and a lot of people fear that. I think another fear that may pertain to more people in this room is a fear of getting it wrong. I don't know enough about race. I don't know enough about history. What if I try to help, but I end up hurting? What if I say something that I shouldn't say? What if a black person or another person of color shuts me down because I did the wrong thing, or I had a good intention, but it didn't come out the right way? Well, let me alleviate your fear. If you're afraid of messing it up, guess what? You will. I promise you'll mess it up. Black folk too. Because here's the thing. You being black doesn't mean you know everything you need to know about race or racism. You must study to learn these things. But here's the thing. If you don't get engaged and make mistakes, you'll never become an effective anti-racist. You have to do it, and you have to keep going. Now, in the Bible, in Joshua chapter 1, I love that chapter. It begins, Moses, my servant, is dead. I love God's bluntness there. Joshua, he dead. What you gonna do? You're the next one up. And then 3 times in those first 9 verses in the chapter of Joshua 1, God says, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. Because you're about to get on God's mission, and guess what? It's going to require some strength. It's going to require some courage. But God doesn't tell Joshua, do it on your own, I'll be back in 6 months. God tells Joshua, be strong and courageous. Why? For I am with you wherever you go. Now, in the Old Testament, God gave Joshua a promise. In the New Testament, God gives the people, his people, a person. That person's name is Jesus Christ. You might know him as Emmanuel, which means what? God with us. So brothers and sisters, as we think about Christian complicity in racism today, you don't have to be afraid of what they're going to call you. They call Jesus everything but his name. You don't have to be afraid of getting it wrong because you're covered in the blood. You don't have to be afraid and practice complicity with racism. You can be courageous and strong like God commanded Joshua and practice a courageous Christianity. Because at the end of the day, brothers and sisters, when we talk about fighting racial injustice, we don't have a how-to problem, but a want-to problem. It's not that we don't know what to do. I promise you, if I gave you 5 minutes and a pen and a paper, you could come up with several anti-racist actions. The problem is, we don't want to do it because we're afraid. But what I'm telling you is that be strong and be courageous. Do not be afraid. Why? Because God is with you wherever you go as you fight racial injustice, wherever it may be found in the congregation, in the nation, and beyond. So thank you very much for coming. supposed to be an academic, but I started out as a preacher. So. They had given me a time limit. But we can take a couple of questions. If you have to depart, that's fine, and we'll also be selling books after this, and I'll be signing. Yes, sir.
Is there ever a point in time when, like I said, I'm just anecdotally, I felt like when I saw America's receptiveness to a person who, like Obama, exhibited more mainstream dispositions and not something that sort of almost culturalized itself into something other. That maybe was an indication that maybe to the extent that Italian, Irish, every other heritage that comes with their culture intact, however, simulating this culture in such a way as to not have race still be a distinguishing factor.
Yeah.
Listening to you, I'm beginning to think that, from the distance between, that whole monolithic European white versus that stark and antithesis, or however you characterize it, black, that maybe that's something that not even, living together and knowing each other really alleviates. I mean, I don't know.
You onto something. If I'm hearing you right, the distance is so great that even in 21st century, where we have a more racially integrated, in a way, society, even that is perhaps not enough to overcome some of this racial divide. And you get to a point that I really didn't have time to get to in the talk, which is very important, which is that relationships are necessary but not sufficient. So along the way, folks got it into their minds that integration was the ideal, when really equality was the ideal. And the way to equality was through integration, because white people had all the good stuff. Think about schools. In Mississippi, they underfunded. They tried to create a dual school system, racially segregated. And the idea was separate, but was it ever equal? No. Not even just from a financial perspective, right? Like, regardless of the whole fact that the entire premise of segregation is itself inherently unequal, which is what Earl Warren said in his 1954 decision. When Mississippi tried to create a dual school system, most of the resources went to white schools. Same with Brown v. Board. What was happening is that Linda Brown's father wanted her to go to a better school, which happened to be what? White. So integration, which is good, certainly from a biblical perspective, but that's not enough if you don't have equality, if you don't have inclusion. And so we've fooled ourselves into thinking that because we have some level of races mixing, black people can go to Valparaiso University now, that we've somehow achieved racial equality, when that was never the case, nor was mere integration ever the goal. So I think you're right. There's a lot more work to do on that end. Yes, sir.
Kind of looking at the green and the red.
Yes, sir.
Those two, because I'm pretty clear about the white. What is the incentive for whites to change the narrative that has produced plutocracy and privilege? I mean, with the two drivers of property as the greatest good,
Yeah.
and the obsession and fear of scarcity,
Yeah.
what's the incentive for whites, even in this room,
Yeah.
to get up and decide, well, I'm going to work against a narrative that provides,
Right. Absolutely.
the privilege and wealth that I have.
That's good. So for those who maybe couldn't hear, what's the incentive for white people to change in general, in terms of this racial caste system that we've set up? Backing up a bit, what you're getting at is the fact that whiteness gives advantages to white people.
Right.
And so why would you give that up? Why would anyone voluntarily give up something that makes them comfortable or is good for them in certain ways? I would argue from a sort of purely human perspective that white supremacy hurts white people too. And the incentive is that the way it's set up, and you mentioned plutocracy, is important. But do we have any billionaires in the room? If you are, I mean, I would just like to, give you a free book. Maybe get your card. But the reality is, it wasn't just white people writ large. In the colonial era and when the Constitution was being drafted, it was white landowning men. In other words, wealthy white men. And many people call the Civil War a wealthy white man's war. And what happens is that there were plenty of poor white people, and still are, but the way they spin the racial narrative is that the person of color is always your enemy. When the reality is, especially if you're poor, you have more in common with a black poor person than you do with a rich white person. And this racial narrative has been used to divide any sort of interracial coalition that might unite against the powers that be. So the argument is that this hurts white people too. And it's only a very, very, very small fraction of people who truly benefit from white supremacy, which is not to say, I mean, whiteness has currency, right? And the reason why poor white people clung to whiteness is because it was better to be poor and white than poor and black.
Doesn't the narrative, the obsession and fear of scarcity, of not having enough, not ever having enough, doesn't that fuel?
Absolutely.
Fuel that?
Yeah, back to that word, fear. Absolutely. Great question. Yes, ma'am, in the blue?
Yes. Your talk highlighted lynchings and direct violence,
Yep.
but actually there's more kinds of violence, and you alluded to it early on.
Yeah.
I think people need to understand that there is institutional violence when the systems keep working the way they are supposed to work or way they are designed to work. And then there's also cultural violence, which we see down on the border. We don't really have to look on the border, but let's go to the border where the kids are separated from their parents. That's a form of cultural violence. And so those are two other forms of violence in addition to direct violence. And people, in this room, all over the world, need to be aware that those systems of violence hurt people too.
That's right. Yeah. Let me end with this. It is, in the last chapter, I give several sort of practical ways to address issues of racism in the church and beyond today. And I use a model called the Arc of Racial Justice. And it is, it's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, and Commitment. And it gets to your point about the different forms of violence. First of all, these are not, it's not a linear process, step one, step two, step three. It's something that's all mixed up and it's ongoing. It's never ending. You're never done with this. But awareness is what you're doing right now. You are getting information. You're increasing your knowledge because you've got to be put on game. Racism works subtly. It's designed to be invisible. And unless you sort of apply yourself to understand the history, the sociology, the psychology, the economics, the politics of it all, you will be a victim of racism without ever even knowing it sometimes. Or you will perpetuate it without knowing it. And so you've got to increase your knowledge. You can do that all kinds of ways. You can watch. Look, here's my favorite response when people ask me a question. It's 2 words. Google it. Literally. First of all, don't put all that work on your black friend to explain everything to you. We tired. Second of all, information has never been so accessible ever. Or in different mediums. There are podcasts, there are blog posts, there are great documentaries out there. I recommend you go home and watch King, The Wilderness Years. It's a PBS special. You can stream it for free. It focuses on 66 to 68, his last few years of life. And it's magnificent. It's not the sanitized King that we hear often in quotes. Go watch the Netflix documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay, who directed it, talking about the crisis of mass incarceration. There's all kinds of ways you can increase your knowledge. Read books. But it doesn't stop there. You can't just have a big head about this. You got to have relationships. When Jesus wanted to reconcile himself to humankind, he didn't send an email or a tweet or a text. He sent himself, a person, which tells us what? That all reconciliation is relational. You got to put flesh and blood on people who have been considered the other. Here's the problem. That's usually where a lot of white people like to stop. It's, some of my best friends are black. Therefore, I can't be racist because I have good relationships. But then it gets to your point. There's other forms of racism. That's where the C comes in, a commitment to anti-racist action. Where we're looking at gerrymandering and say, whether I'm Republican or Democrat or independent, all people should have one vote and it should count. Where we look at the fact that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its incarcerated persons, disproportionately black, brown, and poor. Where we look at the fact that poverty is concentrated in inner cities or certain rural areas, a lot of times where it's a high population of black and brown people. And that's not a coincidence. So what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about the systems of oppression and the systems that create racial injustice? That's where we need Christians to step up and say, it's more than having a cup of coffee with someone. You got to commit to anti-racist action. Wish I had more time. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.